Hey everyone, thank you for joining this Change Nerd episode. Today we are talking about how to make change work in nonprofits. Today's speaker is a good friend of mine, Selena Wilson. She's a seasoned nonprofit executive. She's currently serving as a VP of Organization Effectiveness at East Oakland Youth Development Center. Selena, thank you so much for making time to have this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here. I'm a big fan of ChangeNerd, so happy to contribute to the community.
Awesome. So Selena, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I actually started out in the nonprofit sector. I'm actually an alumni of the organization that I now work with, the East Oakland Youth Development Center, EOYDC for short. I actually started as a child in the African dance program when I was 4 years old. And EOYDC had and still has what we call a cascading mentorship framework. So there's built-in leadership throughout the organization for young people. So my very first job was at EOYDC. I started as a receptionist and went on to be in different youth leadership roles, including the youth director of one of the summer programs that they have there. And and I think that, being in that environment really kind of instilled in me a spirit of service and giving back to the community. I then went on to work for the city of Piedmont, helping to run their after-school programming at a particular site, and simultaneously was getting my bachelor's in human services. And in my case, I was focused on organizational behavior specifically. So that was my very first exposure to change management as a practice. And I was really just blown away because I was working in mission-driven organizations. I was seeing, the need to change, and just knowing that there were a set of practices that could help enable this really was powerful. And, after graduating and being in my position with the city of Piedmont for 5 years and serving on the board of directors for another nonprofit that's really important to me, I found myself running into a lot of walls in the realm of transformation, and decided that I wanted to really deepen my skill set in that area. And so I sought out a graduate program that would help me do that, and found the perfect program for me at Northwestern University. They have a really excellent practitioner-focused program called the Masters of Science in Learning and Organizational Change, or MSLC. As you'll see, almost every acronym I'm a part of is super long. So when I went to MSLC, I was really, really clear. I remember our very first assignment was to develop an individual learning plan, and we had to outline our short and long-term goals. And my short-term goal, I said specifically that after graduation, I wanted to work in a management consulting firm, such as Deloitte. I specifically named Deloitte. And I named Deloitte because I knew that Deloitte had an element of community focus. They had done some pro bono work with the nonprofit that I was on the board of. I was familiar with initiatives like Impact Day, which is a org-wide community service day. And so I thought, this seems like a firm that is aligned with my values in that sense, but will also give me exposure to understanding how private sector firms do things, because I thought there would be great value in spending a few years working with private sector clients, because they're well known for their efficiencies and that sort of thing. And my long-term goal, as stated, was that I wanted to then, after a few years of consulting, go back to the nonprofit sector. I specifically named East Oakland Youth Development Center as my dream org, and as it has it, I ended up back there.
Wow.
And even in my interview with Deloitte, when they asked me what I saw myself doing in 5 and 10 years, I was very transparent that I always had the intention of going back to the nonprofit world, and that this was really about me learning and wanting to be able to figure out ways that I could take the best of both worlds and kind of fuse them together, because, mission-driven organizations typically struggle, I think, with a lot of the more process-oriented things, because the people attracted to that field, we tend to be very people-oriented.
Yes.
And sometimes process can suffer. And therefore, ironically, people can suffer. So that was a very long story, but that's that.
No, that's so cool. One thing I admire about you is that you're purposeful in your decision making, and you're so mission driven. So that's just one thing I really admire about you. Let's talk about it. And for me, honestly, I didn't realize that you had such a rich history in the nonprofit space. because we met at Deloitte. So like
Right.
that was my starting point. So this is
Yeah.
cool to learn that it didn't just start a couple of years ago. This has been in your heart for a long time. So what is it about the nonprofit space that is so challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of challenges in the nonprofit sector that are pretty unique to the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, nonprofit means that we're not working for a profit. We're not working for shareholders. And oftentimes we're very limited in terms of financial resources. A lot of nonprofits tend to have constraints on the resources as well, because the way that the funding landscape works for nonprofits is that funders have the right to restrict their funds. So they can tell you how you can spend them and how you can't spend them. And I think part of what those who are in leadership positions, need to do is help funders understand and see the value in capacity building around things like change management and organizational effectiveness, because they're the ones that can earmark funds. And I had the really, really wonderful opportunity with working with an initiative called Propel Next, which was piloted and sponsored by the Edna McCarnell Clock Foundation with support from other foundations, including Hewlett. And I think they're really revolutionary in that they see the value in change management, and specifically worked with nonprofit organizations to build their capacity to not only be more data driven, but have the capacity that you need to kind of then be responsive to that data. Because, nonprofits over the last few years have really been compelled by donors and funders to get more data, collect more data inputs. But what are you going to do with the data if the data is telling you that you need to make some changes, right? You have to be responsive to the data. And to be responsive to the data, as we know as change management practitioners, there are some specific capacities that you have to have in place. So for nonprofits, there's often a very limited capacity when it comes to change management. It's very, very rare that organizations have folks in positions such as myself that are focused on organizational effectiveness. And so oftentimes they'll rely.
I was going to say, is it at a certain size that you tend to see positions like yours?
I think that size is definitely an element. Though, we're not an extremely large organization. Our annual budget is $2.76 million. We're a single site organization. We have a staff of around 25. A lot of the organizations that I do know that have this kind of internal capacity are much larger. And so for a lot of organizations, particularly the smaller ones, to your point, they're reliant on external resources in the case that they do need change management, but that often comes at a very high premium. And so I think for nonprofits, you have to, again, because you are reliant on external funders, you have to make the case for it, or bake it into your grants, right? And kind of bake it into and make a clear case for how is this directly aligned with our mission. You also have a different kind of governance structure than most private organizations do. So the way in which the board really determines a lot of key decisions tends to be very different in the nonprofit sector. The other thing that I think is different is that I think in a lot of private sector organizations, there's a culture that is inherently centered around leadership. And that's not to say that that doesn't happen in nonprofits.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of folks that are attracted to this space are very grassroots oriented. And so from a change management perspective, if you go the route of kind of the leadership just taking the charge and driving things, without kind of I think the top-down strategy often backfires in nonprofit settings in a way that's different. And I know that even in private sector, we talk about the importance of creating change champions and having engagement at all levels, but I think it's particularly important that the folks doing the groundwork in nonprofits are involved from the beginning, including those that you serve. And so that was kind of a long answer, but those are some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So if you, I use framework and mindset kind of anonymously, but like, what's and you kind of hinted at some of the things that will bring us to the right mindset. But if you had to, talk to your younger self, or if you had to consult another nonprofit organization that's similar to yours, what would you tell them? What are some recommendations that you would give to them so that they would start off the right way?
Yeah, I think that we have to always be mindful of our mission, right? And so while we also have strategies, our metrics are generally much more ill structured, as they would say, or if we're talking from an adaptive leadership standpoint, most of our challenges are not technical. Most of our challenges are very complex and involve a lot of players. We're oftentimes also dealing a lot in cross-sector kind of relations, because it's very rare that a nonprofit can deliver services without partnerships and that sort of thing. So I think that one of the things that I would advise and do advise folks on the nonprofit sector to do is to really, really pay attention to stakeholder management. I think that's one of the most important things from a nonprofit standpoint. And stakeholder management has to include folks that are doing direct service from the very beginning. It has to be day one. I think that you also have to include a cross-section of folks that represent your service population from the very close to the very beginning. Because again, we're dealing with very complex issues, and we're also dealing with people who, we often talk about, in my field of study, there are three main factors that can get in the way of a change management initiative. Yeah. Skill, will, and heal, right? You got to ask yourself, is this a skill issue? Do people not know how to do this thing, or there's a capacity gap? Will, right? Are they not motivated to make the change? Or heal, are there obstacles in their way? And so I think from a skill standpoint, you have to reckon with the fact that generally speaking, nonprofits have fewer resources to invest in capacity building. So you have to really make the case with your board and your funders for why capacity building is essential, yeah, and why there should be funds earmarked for that. From a will standpoint or a motivation standpoint, you have to make sure that it is very, very clear to people that how this ties to our mission. How does this really get to, and I'm particularly when you're dealing with things that seem more further removed from the mission. And I'll give an example of that in a bit. But if you're dealing with something that does feel a little bit further removed, like I didn't sign up for this job so that I can be dealing with data management systems. Yeah. I'm here to help the people, right? You have to really make it very clear, how does this directly help people? How does this really make a difference in people's lives, even if it feels far removed from that? And from a hill standpoint, or a kind of barrier to change standpoint, you have to really do a clear analysis of the context and the environment. The ways in which regulations impact nonprofits are pretty unique. The ways in which board bylaws and governance affect nonprofits are pretty unique, right? So taking a really careful look at the potential barriers and getting ahead of that early, because the other thing is that in the public sector, things tend to move a lot slower. And we learned that the hard way when we really set out to make this particular new pilot program. We really took for granted that partners would be able to respond more quickly than they were to the change. Yeah. And so we had learned, what? We should have engaged partners very close to the beginning, because it took them so much longer to get through the paperwork. In this case, these were school partners. Wow. So the school district, they have all of these different processes and procedures that they have to go through that take a lot more time than we had anticipated. So those are some things that you have to be very, very mindful of.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Selena, listen, thank you so much for contributing your insight in this webcast. Is there anything else that you want to leave with the group before we close down?
Yeah, I think that, we often talk about how the pace of change in the private sector is swift. We talk about the market forces and how with e-commerce and things like that, folks are having to be much more responsive. And I think we're seeing a very similar phenomenon in nonprofit. I work, for example, in a youth-focused nonprofit. And the ways in which these same forces and factors, globalization, internet, all of these things, they're having a very similar impact on the pace at which conditions are changing for the people that we serve. And so I think that we have to really be mindful of the fact that the pace of the world is changing. And one of the things that we need to think about on a systemic level in terms of change in the nonprofit sector is how can we cut down the bureaucracy? How can we really start to work to make ourselves more agile so we can be more responsive to the changes that we're seeing in our environments so that we can change more rapidly? And to that end, how can we start building in these capacities so that internally we're prepared, even if you can't afford to have a role dedicated to it? How can you be building these capacities for change management and for being responsive to these things throughout the organization?
That's awesome. That's awesome. One last question, Selena. What's the social networking profile for nonprofits? Do you see a lot of nonprofit organizations kind of networking with each other and kind of leveraging best practices from one another? Do you see that happening as much as it should, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because one of the things that I lament on often is that we are way too siloed. So I think that is starting to break down a bit, the silos. But yeah, I think that we're not networking enough, but not just networking. I think that we're not really collaborating enough, because there are a lot of times, again, like I said, in a nonprofit setting in particular, we're dealing with systemic issues, generally speaking. And so you cannot solve these things on your own. There has to be collaboration if we're really going to address these challenges at the population level. And so at EOYDC, for example, one of our strategic imperatives is really enhancing our partnerships. And so we're looking to both private and public sector partners and saying, here are some of the population challenges we're looking at. Literacy, school partners, what part can you play? Corporate partners, what part can you play? School districts, what part can you play? Really taking a look at bringing folks to the table and saying, here's our capacity, what's your capacity? How can we really join forces? Because we have this common interest, which are the people that we serve.
Yes.
And that gets back to really cutting down the bureaucracy. And I think, again, one of the things that I cannot emphasize enough, nonprofit folks have to really think very early on in the change initiative, who else needs to be at the table? Who are the influencers? Who are the folks who have things to bring? Who are the people who potentially can remove some of these barriers that we're dealing with, and bring them to the table early? Because, if you bake out the change and then bring them to the table, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to totally shift what you planned, because they're going to be telling you all these things that you hadn't considered. So bring folks from the outside to the table early on to help you with those insights.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Selena. So how can everyone find you? I know you're on LinkedIn. Are there any other websites? How can people find you?
Yeah, I'm very, very active here on LinkedIn. So I definitely encourage folks to reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions, hop on a call. I also encourage folks to follow our nonprofit on social media. So the East Oakland Youth Development Center, or EOYDC. Mm-hmm. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We also have, of course, a website, www.eoydc.org. Awesome. Folks can also email me, which is just simply my first name, Selena, at eoydc.org.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, Selena, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.